Hey y'all, I know at this year's sales kickoff that security is one of our big themes. Specifically, what I want to talk about today is how security differentiates us from our three primary competitors. But before we dive in, I want to paint a landscape of the world that we're in today. So one of the big startling statistics that I want to start this conversation off with is the fact that we are expected as a global society to have around $6 trillion in wealth transfer due to a cyber attack in our current year. And so this is unprecedented, and this is the highest it's ever been at any point in time. We have to ask ourselves the question of why this is happening, because this is ultimately a problem that all of our customers are facing. And to put this number into a little bit more context, this is going to be the greatest transfer of economic wealth in history from a sheer monetary point of view. We're talking about amount of money that is greater than all of the natural disasters combined together in a given year, and also more profitable than all of the entire global illegal drug trade. So this is an absolutely massive problem that many of our customers are facing. We know how this affects many of our customers. We read about it in the front page of the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal. We understand that this is a loss of reputation and oftentimes monetarily hurts our customers. But one of the things that you may not be as aware of is the fact that many of these cyber criminals, they're really going after the vulnerable in the important parts of societies. So what we're talking about is targeting hospital chains, going after patient records. A lot of times how this works is that they'll give a hospital network 72 hours to pay some Bitcoin. If the Bitcoin isn't paid, then they're going to wipe all the databases of many of these hospital networks, basically shutting down really essential public infrastructure. We've also seen that this has gone up a very large amount during coronavirus, simply because of how important hospital networks are at this point in time. Other things that are affected are school networks. This is a school network in the United States. And what we're also talking about is the fact that many of these thieves are going after the vulnerable. And so what we're talking about is that they're going after the elderly and children a lot of the time. And so these aren't people that may not have as much awareness of what phishing and how to necessarily spot a suspicious email. And so some statistics, over 1 in 4 older adults aged 55 and older have experienced identity theft. In the United States, over 1 million children have experienced identity theft 4 years ago, costing families around $500 million in out-of-pocket expenses. So this is a huge problem that's affecting every layer of our society. And before we really start talking about, some of our differentiation stuff, we have to basically ask ourselves the question of why is this happening in the first place? And the reason is actually pretty simple at a fundamental level. The reason why is because if you went back to the year 1980, then a simple website like this, maybe several thousand lines of code, may run on a couple hundred servers, but everything is generally pretty simple. Compare that with today's environment, in which the average application is within the 25 and 50 million lines of code range. And so some statistics, Google Chrome is around 7 million lines of code. Facebook is around 60 million lines of code. And these are applications that are running on hundreds of thousands of servers distributed across many different continents. And so what we're talking about is that there's just so many lines of code, so many servers, things are so complicated that it's just much, much, much easier to attack one of these corporations. You are only as strong as your weakest link in cybersecurity. So regardless of how sophisticated your defenses are, if you have one breach, your entire network can be breached. And ultimately, what we're talking about is the difference between securing a private residence, something that you could do in a couple of months, and securing something like a 4,000-mile border. That's the world that we're in today. All of those millions of lines of code, those hundreds of thousands of servers, that's just so much stuff to secure. This is the reason why cyber attack is now greater at any point in human history. And all of this has brought us to a point in which the best practice in cyber resilience is to assume that you've already been compromised. So right now, a lot of IT professionals aren't focused in making sure that people don't get into their network. What they're focused on is in making sure that if someone does get into their network, that they're not going to get all of the data. So maybe they might separate the data out into many different data centers. And this is just a startling fact that it's just so hard to secure your network in your data center that this is something that people have to do. This is the world that we live in today. So what are people doing about it? It really has to do with the market segment that you're in. We'll start with small, medium business, and then we'll work through the other market segments. So for small, medium business, many of these businesses are really focused on becoming profitable, coming up with their first application. And so they're really development focused. You don't really become security conscious until you have a large number of customers. And so for many of these small businesses, they're low cost operations. They probably don't have any security engineers, may not have any security tools at all in their environment. And ultimately for these businesses, security really means just hiring good developers. Let's talk about what happens as businesses mature. As businesses mature, many of these corporations go the contracted services or consulting route. And the reason why is because cybersecurity engineers are extremely expensive. If you don't have enough work to warrant one full time, then it makes more sense to contract out maybe 160, 200 hours of work every couple of months. And so it's a cost-cutting measure. The other reason why people go the managed services route a lot of the time is because it's so hard to get up and running in cybersecurity. We're talking about something that's extraordinarily complicated. To even like recruit the talent, to manage all of that requires someone who's very, very, very dedicated. This chart is an example of many of the cybersecurity tools that are out there. And so it's just so hard to get up and running in cybersecurity. This is one of the other reasons why people go the managed services route. Let's talk about the enterprise. So as corporations get very large, typically they end up building their own internal teams. They don't want to pay someone else to do this. And so what they end up with is expansive dedicated security teams. Many of the times, these security teams will be spread out across many different geographic locations. So you may have one in Austin, Texas. You may have one in France. You may have one in India. And what ends up happening is many of these security teams turn into silos, ultimately fighting with developers. And so what we're talking about this fundamentally is a lack of communication. And so what I mean by this is, imagine if your development team is in San Francisco, Chicago, and New York, and your cybersecurity teams are in India, and if they're in France. Well, just because of that lack of coordination, sometimes geographical distance, many other things, then there's just going to be problems that happen because of a lack of communication. The number three thing that happens in many of these large organizations is a proliferation of tools. We'll talk a little bit more about that, and ending up with a very large budget. We'll talk a little bit about that too. So if you think about finance, healthcare, the government, these are the three industries that we're talking about today. This is a good diagram of what happens when you don't have good communication across your organization. In my experience and career as someone who was an engineer for half a decade, this is the rule, not the exception. From what I've seen, around 20% of all of the work that an organization pushes out in general ends up not being used. And so if you think about the organizational cost to a large enterprise, you're talking about up to 20% of your entire budget being spent on work that's not doing anything. And so breaking down those silos and increasing communication across your organization is a huge way to make your overall engineering organization more efficient. Let's talk about tool proliferation now. And so I'm going to give you some numbers to put this into perspective. And so what we've found using consulting research is that the average small organization has around 15 to 20 cybersecurity tools. The average medium-sized business has around 50 to 60, and the average large enterprise has over 130 tools. So what we're talking about is that if you're thinking about a large company like Bank of America or Airbus, you're talking about 130 tools to procure, 130 tools to get up and running, 130 tools to potentially integrate, and having to hire talent to maintain those tools. It's a huge problem. And going a little bit more into ballooning cost. So this is a huge issue that is faced across our industry. The big problem is that even though the threat of cyber attack is only increasing year after year, many of the budgets that these companies have are linear or flat. And so they're being asked to do more with less. Let's talk about how GitLab can help. So with small, medium business and commercial, one of the big things that we talked about is how it's really hard to get up and running in cybersecurity. The reason why is because this is something that's extremely specialized. It's very, very complicated. And so one of the ways in which we can pitch the GitLab security bundle is that we can help you to do things internally by giving you a bundle of security tools that are all integrated together, as opposed to having to go out and buy 10 different things, integrate them together, get up and running, research them. All you have to do is get GitLab. And so GitLab can be your one stop to having really good baseline security coverage across your application development. The other way in which we can really start pitching security for the SMB space is the fact that, once again, many of these businesses are really focused on developing software quickly. They know that they have a finite amount of time before their funding runs out. And so one of their main goals is to make sure that they're efficient. With DevSecops, we can make sure that they are efficient, becoming more secure across their applications while still not compromising their development deadlines. Let's talk about enterprise now. So as a review of the 4 problems that many of these enterprises face, number 1 is that they have siloed teams. It could be a geographic problem. It's also one of those things in which, if you think about sales and marketing, it's very similar to that, in which they just have different goals a lot of the time. And when they're not aligned, they end up just like creating wasted work. So if you think about the difference between security and development, it's a similar thing where developers, their entire job is to make sure that applications are up and running and that they meet project deadlines. But the problem is that security's job is often to be the bad guy and to push back and to make them do more work. And then so oftentimes these teams are naturally in conflict with each other. Another big problem with many enterprises is that security is verified in an inefficient manner after development. And so what I'm talking about this is all the development maybe happens across 4 to 6 months. And at the end of that, security is verified for these applications after everything's already done. This is an inefficient way of developing software and something that we can improve. And then just as an overview, the other 2 problems are tool proliferation. And so just imagine having 130 sets of data that need to be analyzed, and cost. So solution number 1 for breaking down silos, what we bring to the table here is the fact that we allow all different types of engineers, regardless of your specialty, to collaborate on the GitLab platform. And so with something like GitHub, typically you just have developers on it. But with something like GitLab, you can have operations, you can have security, you can have test. And because of that, we can allow organizations to systematically have better collaboration, ultimately becoming more efficient. This is something that personally motivates me. If I had GitLab when I was an engineer, this really would have made sure that I was more efficient across all of the time that I spent as an engineer. Let's talk about DevSecops. So the number 2 problem with many of these organizations is the fact that they are verifying security after development has already happened. The big problem with this is that changes are happening. So from a developer perspective, you're being asked to fix something that you did 3 months ago. You probably don't even remember what you were doing 3 months ago. And then so the cost of fixing some of these issues that the security team finds all the way at the end of the release cycle is fixing these issues when the cost of the organization is highest. How we solve this is through allowing organizations to implement DevSecops. And so this is an example of the merge request screen. What this is showing is that for every single time a developer is trying to change something, then we actually show all of the security issues that these changes are proposing. And so developers have feedback now to solve security issues during development. Ultimately, this allows organizations to become more efficient throughout the board. And so to really bring this home, all of this happens through our automated CI/CD. And this is an example chart of the cost that we save in an organization. If you fix a security issue when it's already in production, you have to basically now roll out and revisit all of those servers, tear them down, rebuild them, in addition to making the software fix in the first place. Versus if you catch a security issue during the test phase during development, then you don't have to deal with redeploying all of those servers. And the best way to do this is to catch issues during the coding phase itself. The reason why is because if I'm a developer, I'm writing something, and within 4 hours, I have security feedback, then I can fix that issue when that issue is fresh in my mind. I just wrote that code. It's very easy for me right now to fix something that I've been writing on all day. And so this is an example of how DevSecops helps organizations to become more efficient across the board and how we can allow them to become faster across the board as well. Let's talk about toolchain proliferation. This is something that we talk about all the time, but one of the things that we really do that's kind of unique is, and something that I already alluded to, is the fact that for many of these large organizations, they have over 100 security tools. And so that's 130 different inputs of data. And so to even have like a bird's eye view of what's happening in your organization is really hard. What we bring to the table is we actually give you a security dashboard that allows leaders to see the current state of their security within their organization. And so this is the number of vulnerabilities that an organization has. This is how people have been trending in time by severity. So in the last 30 days, the amount of critical issues that my organization has had has gone down 12%. So we're making positive progress. We can also grade you. So across your organization, right now we have 5 different projects. And so 2 of them really aren't doing a good job. 1 of them is still not doing a good job. And then we have 2 that are performing really well from a security perspective. And so once again, we give an organizational leader a bird's eye view on their current state of security. Let's talk about cost reduction. So the main ways in which we do this is that we make all of engineering more efficient with DevSecops. And so what we're talking about is fixing vulnerabilities when they are fresh in the developer's minds, as opposed to 4, 6, 9 months later. And so we may make an organization 15, 20% more efficient across the board simply because of DevSecops. And when you think about some of these large organizations maybe have several $100 million engineering budget. Saving 15–20% is a huge cost reduction. The other thing is simple tool consolidation, as opposed to having license costs for many of these AppSec tools out there. If you just get GitLab, then you can save on cost as well. So let's talk about our competitors. This is the meat and the potatoes of this presentation. We'll start with Jenkins. Jenkins was something that I used for about 5 years, and so I can speak from experience here. What I've seen in the field is that the vast majority of Jenkins users do not do any sort of automated security testing for development. And so all of those really great benefits of DevSecops, of shifting left that we talked about, most of these organizations don't have any of that. And so what they're missing out on is having the reduction in overall project time and operational efficiency that you get from DevSecops. That being said, there are some ways to hook in security into Jenkins. You can do this through either plugins or integrations that you write. But the big problem with all these things is that now you have a plugin. We've already discussed about how plugins lead to just like complexity in your IT environment in the first place. And all the integrations are something that you have to write. That takes people time. With GitLab, this is something that we give you out of the box. One additional sales motion to be aware of is that you can actually use GitLab CI and our DevSecops with Jenkins. So if you have a customer is interested in GitLab security, maybe is stuck with Jenkins because of some sort of organizational mandate, then we can combine them together so that they can keep their Jenkins and still get the benefit of GitLab Secure. Let's talk about GitHub. So one of the things to really keep in mind with GitHub is that they really are trying to copy our roadmap right now. And so we have around 10 different things that we do for security. And from my research, they have around 3. And so things that they have in particular is SAST, dependency scanning, and secret scanning. Now compare that with what we bring to the table. So in our secure phase, we have 7 different items that we offer. The 3 that they bring to the table are highlighted here. And in addition to the protect phase, they don't have any of this stuff too. GitHub does not do anything with server protection. They are all on the application security side. And so they're behind us right now. One other thing to keep in mind with GitHub security is that just how they do things a little bit differently than us. What we do is that if you want security, it's generally all in the ultimate tier. They actually give their security features to all of their pricing tiers. And so they don't differentiate their pricing tiers by the security features that they offer. Let's talk about the GitHub marketplace. So this is something that I hear all the time. GitHub was actually really smart with how they did this. So about a year ago, they realized they have a huge feature disparity between them and GitLab. They also realized that they have the largest open source user base. And so what they did is they created an ecosystem where other people in the open source community could actually extend GitHub itself. So if there's something missing from GitHub from a features perspective, chances are you can get it from the GitHub marketplace. Now, there are really big problems with the marketplace. One is the fact that GitHub Actions in general are insecure. We'll talk a little bit more about why that's the case. 2 is the problem that you just have more work now. You have to evaluate the actions, you have to install them, you have to integrate them, you have to make sure that they're updated. And number 3 is the fact that many of these actions actually cost money. And then so you have a bill for your GitHub, and then in addition, maybe half of your actions add on to that bill. And so it actually increases your overall cost. Versus if you just have a GitLab subscription, then you have one price for everything for GitLab. So this is GitHub Actions. If I go into the GitHub Actions portal, I can see right now that there are 7,073 different actions that are available. And so this is a really large number of different plugins that you can get. You can think about an action as a plugin. The problem with this is that if I go to the verified section, out of that 7,000 actions, only 77 of them are currently verified. And so what we're talking about is that if a customer goes out and gets some of these actions, they're really out there on their own. I did some research to find out how someone can become a verified creator of a GitHub action. And then so someone from GitHub, this is what they said. They said, currently, there's no way to request verification. Creators of actions are verified because they have an existing relationship with GitHub, and GitHub has worked closely with the creator to create their action. We are currently continuing to evaluate this process, and we may open it up more broadly in the future. So in other words, 77 of these actions are verified. They're verified by both Microsoft and the vendor. But for the remaining almost 7,000 actions out there, you're on your own, right? There's no real organization that is verifying the security of many of these actions, unless this is done by an enterprise vendor. Now let's talk about a little bit more about the security risk of some of these actions. And so the big problem with actions is the fact that your code as some sort of large business, if you think Netflix or Google, is one of your most prized assets. And the more tools that are looking at your code, if there's any compromise in any of those tool vendors, then all of a sudden you've lost your most prized asset. And then so if we think about it, if we just use GitHub, then we're only worried about GitHub being compromised. If we're using GitHub and now 10 additional vendors for our actions, if any of those action vendors have a compromise, then all of a sudden I've lost my most valuable asset. And so the idea here is that GitHub Actions increases the number of companies that are looking at my code, and it increases my overall attack surface. So if I just Google GitHub Actions security, let's actually see what the community is saying. Out of the first 10 results, everything looks good. We would expect in general to find a bunch of GitHub Actions on application security. But now let's take a look at some of the other results. Number 4 is use GitHub Actions at your own risk. Number 5 is GitHub Actions design flaw leaves security hole. Next one is important security implications for GitHub Actions. Let's look at the next set of Google results. Are GitHub Actions safe to use? The security of GitHub Actions. GitHub Actions platform vulnerable to code injection attacks. And so one of the things that you can tell your customers is don't just take our word for it. Take a look and do some research on your own. Show them the Google results. Show them what other people are saying. This is something that I do on my calls all the time. The other thing that I want to talk about for GitHub Action security risk is going back to the fact that out of that 7,000 actions, a huge number of these are open source projects. And then so the problem with this is that there's no one who's responsible for maintaining and updating this open source project. Someone could build it and then retire. If you're using that action, then it's never going to get updated. And then so the big problem with this is that you have a lot more work and responsibility for making sure that your GitHub setup remains secure. And so this is very similar motion and problem with maintaining Jenkins plugins, is maintaining the GitHub Actions. So you can think about it as something similar to Jenkins plugins. Let's talk about Azure DevOps now. So Azure DevOps, one of the things to note about it is that it doesn't really come with any security when you get it initially, but it has this one extension that you can get from their marketplace that gives you baseline application security testing. And so once again, the vendor for Azure DevOps is the same as the vendor for Microsoft. And so they built out an extensions marketplace for Azure DevOps as well. And so because of this, there are similar problems as with GitHub Actions. And so we're talking about increasing security risk for the same reasons as with GitHub. We're talking about more extensions to evaluate, integrate, procure, and ultimately the fact that now you have a license fee for Azure DevOps, and you could potentially be paying additional money for some of the extensions that you're getting out of the marketplace. So more complicated billing. Let's talk about some of the questions that we can ask. For small, medium business, many of these businesses are really trying to move as quickly as possible. So one of the things that I recommend, depending on what their goals are, is let's not talk about security first. Let's actually talk about SCM and CI, because this is generally what they are more interested in. But if they are interested in security, after some good qualifying questions, we can ask things like, what does application security look like for your organization? Many of these organizations don't really have application security, and they know that they should. And then so this is just a way to start mentioning the fact that, hey, we actually offer really great baseline coverage for your AppSec. Another question that I really like is, if there were an easy way to get set up and running with application security in a way that speeds up your overall engineering process, would you like to hear about it? Once again, speed is something that really matters for SMB. Let's talk about the commercial segment. So once again, contractors, managed services, and eventually getting out your own internal teams. This is something that's pretty common in the commercial space. So asking questions like, hey, if you contracted this out, tell me about it. Do you like it? Are you happy with the cost of these contracted services? Are you happy with the quality of the work? Many of these companies feel like they know that there is a better way of doing it, but they think it's cost prohibitive. And then so you can now say something like, hey, there's actually a less expensive way of doing this. We can help you become more efficient in your application security while not breaking the bank. Let me tell you about how. Another question that I really like to ask is, how often do you revise your applications because of security vulnerabilities? When I was an engineer, this is something that happened all the time. And every time you have to make a 3.1 or a 3.2, or even if you imagine every time you update your iPhone, it creates a ton of work for all of engineers to get everything up and running and to make that next release. And so it's a way to start that conversation going. It is a way to uncover pain. And so that's another question that I like to ask. Let's talk about enterprise and things like public sector as well. So what does the relationship between development and security look like in your organization? Have you ever had any misses because of a lack of communication? Misses because of a lack of communication are very common in large organizations. If you're talking to a senior level leader, you can ask something like, would you like to hear about adopting latest trends in security testing and how that can make your entire organization more efficient? Another question that you could ask is, how often do you have to fix your applications? How often do they impact your customers? If there were a more efficient way of doing this, would you like to hear about it? And now all of a sudden you hook in the security team. Let's talk about personas too. So in terms of prospecting new accounts, it's the same thing that we generally use. So focusing on the development side. And the reason why is because the vast majority of security pain is felt on the development side. These are the people that are writing code, really stressed for deadlines, and being told over and over again, hey, you need to go fix your stuff, maybe something that you wrote 4 months ago. And so the majority of the pain is felt on the development side. That being said, one good way that I've seen this done, shout out to Katie Ramos, is let's start that conversation going on the development side. After you have that conversation going, then hook in the security decision makers and then combine them into the conversation. And then all of a sudden, now you have an opportunity for ultimate. Let's bring everything home. Security testing is one of the defining problems of our time. This is something that I firmly believe in. I think that something has to systematically change across our global society and how we are doing things, because right now the solution that we have isn't working in protecting the most vulnerable of our planet. So that being said, this is a good opportunity for us because we are different than other approaches. Once again, for all the other approaches out there, it involves having lots and lots and lots of different tools. We are different because we are the first tool that offers consolidation. Our product team is investing heavily here to maintain this advantage. And ultimately, when we tell our story, we can change how organizations are run. And so that's the value that we bring our customers. Thanks for attending today's talk.